to start the tape, I should say that we're at the office of Heathwood, Cardillo, Wilson, in Wynnum. It's the 29th of November 2012. We're interviewing Peter Heathwood. Roger Heathwood. Yeah, I don't know if I could mention you, but that's you. And here interviewing your Robert Riddel, Elizabeth Musgrave, and Janina, Gosseye, myself.
What was your name?
Janina, Gosseye.
Janina?
Yes, that's it.
And surname?
Gosseye.
Gosseye.
Yes.
From?
I'm from Belgium.
Belgium. Yeah.
Yes.
I've been to Belgium to look at the Australian dead.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Because an uncle of mine, well, he would have been an uncle if I'd been born early enough. It's still there. Or Roger and mine, I should say. Yeah.
So I think maybe the first warm-up question we'll ask you is, what made you decide to study architecture?
Oh, from a very early age, I was designing houses with flat roofs and helicopter landings and things. About 10 or something like that. But then I didn't think about it at all and didn't do any study and failed exams at school. So I lost that. And then in order to do senior, I got a job at the city council so I could do it at night. And there I was put in the construction officer's office, writing out orders for leaky taps to be fixed and places to be painted, and I gradually thought a bit about building construction. And my predecessor in that office was Rob Gibson, and his predecessor was Perry, was a partner at Cook and Curtin.
Bland?
No, Perry Bland, whatever.
Russell Kerrison?
No, this was Perry. He was a Wynnum boy too, and I knew him for a long time. In the event, there were somewhat illustrious predecessors in that job, and that led me to. I went there to start with because I could have. I think I told you, have an easy day because I could go to study at night, and in that I was preceded by a number of fellows in that office, and that led into the architectural office, because Frank Costello, who was the city architect, city town planner, city building surveyor, took an interest in young blokes in the place, and he led us into.
But there was, in your family, was there anybody that was involved in architecture?
Nobody.
And what year was this that you went to the council?
Well, I did first year in 51, so it must have been 1950.
So this is before Jim Birrell gets there.
Oh yes, long time before, although Jim had quite an influence in my professional life. But anyway, and
so you got through your senior and you were able
yes,
to...
so I did senior 1 year at night, after failing scholarship and failing junior.
Wow.
And that put me back to being the youngest in the class again, because I was always the youngest everywhere I went. And Peter Gargett thought he was, but we found out he was just a few weeks older than me.
When you were in the architect's office at the Brisbane City Council, what sort of things were you working on there?
Oh, public toilets.
Excellent.
And helping, doing details of substations, because in those days the City Council ran the electricity for Brisbane. And that was a pretty big department, electricity department. And pump houses.
There's one just near the airport. Is that one you remember?
I remember it, but I had nothing to do with it. Yeah, but Frank Costello was a very good architect.
Yeah.
He's somebody that ought to be. Somebody's doing a history of him.
There was a good thesis on him.
Somebody contacted me about him, and I was able to fill in a lot of gaps.
He
for him.
designed these 2 rows of shops.
Yeah, these little shops for his. Yeah.
Well, I can remember him at QUT as well. Or
Yes.
QIT.
Well, that was before my time, but he was somewhat influenced by the Dutch architects at the time. You can see it in these substations he designed. But he was also a very good thinker. He was a Rome scholar. The only other Rome scholar I've struck in Queensland was Bob Cummings.
You say influenced by the Dutch architects, and how would you...
Well, you can see in his buildings
Green brick.
a lot of the a lot of effect of it. Not very much tropicalised either.
And how would you have, would they have gained access to these examples via journals, to the Dutch production?
I can't think of their names now.
Dudok was one.
Dudok is
Yes.
one.
But they were there in the war or not? I mean, is that how they became aware of
No,
what was happening in
the
Holland?
buildings I'm talking about
No,
were
but
pre-war, and they had, I thought, pretty clever little things like great blank walls, but which were necessary. But the fellow articulated it with the downpipes.
An architecture of downpipes.
It didn't look boring at all.
Frank Costello, I think, got a travelling scholarship to travel and
Yes.
after he finished study.
Okay.
From Sydney.
Yes.
Not from
Yeah.
Queensland.
He was very good to me. He didn't sack me when there was reason to do so, which we won't go into, but
You managed to
for
get
being
put
very
off
cheeky.
anyway.
Cheeky. Okay.
So, what architectural qualifications did you gain, and from which institutions have you?
Well, I went to what was the Central Technical College, which was the only course in Queensland at the time. The university hadn't kicked off, I think. You'd have to check that.
This is 51.
51.
Didn't you do your final year at UQ?
I did later, yes.
Yeah.
But we started off at Central Technical
Yeah.
College, and we did the first 3 years there. And then a situation arose that the U of Q had started, and in our year there were only 3 students, Peter Gargett and Greenfield and Margaret somebody. And in the following year they only had 1 student, John Jasinski. So we were obliged to go out to St Lucia, still at night, but it was a fair bugger because we all worked in the city, or nearly all. And so we ended up getting a peculiar thing called a Diploma of Architecture from the U of Q. But it was, I didn't think the training was nearly as good because I didn't care for Cummings. I think he was very clever. But the fellows at the Tech were all practicing architects who lectured you, with one exception. A fellow that designed the old library at North Quay, Fluff Weller.
Yes.
Yeah, well, when I say he was practicing, he was working in an architect's office, but I don't know that he was ever a qualified architect.
And Charlie Fulton there then?
Yeah, well, Charlie Fulton, Athol Bretnell, what was the name of that firm then? Blythe, Jessup.
Yes.
Cole Jessup was there.
teaching how to watercolour beautifully.
Yeah.
He was
He
great.
taught us how to watercolour, not about the beautiful bit, but you know, they were very serious architects
And they were all at the
at
technical.
the Tech,
Yes.
and most of the people that were in my course were, well, not most, but well, there were 33 or something of us in first year, and they had a policy of weeding them out, you know, so there were 7 after in second year, and John Dalton, Wolf Hughes, anyway, quite a few of them were ex-servicemen, and they'd sat around in camps for years thinking about the great new world that they were going to make after, and they influenced us a lot because they weren't in any way frivolous. Ollie Ryan was another one, or Owen Ryan, you might have him recorded as. Some of them weren't themselves great architects, some were, but they were very serious students, and so we green young fellows coming along, they taught us concentration, and they taught us how to drink.
Important.
And who was teaching what? What was Riddel teaching and what was Jessup teaching?
Riddel was teaching interior design. Charlie Fulton was teaching design. I don't know what the others were doing now. It's all a bit blurry. And apart from which, we were pretty tired because we'd knock off work at 5 and be down there at 6 and knock off at 9 and then go to the pub till 10 and then ride your motorbike home. And it wasn't very sensible way of living, but we got to know one another fairly well.
And were you also taught history of architecture?
Did?
History of architecture? Was somebody teaching?
Who taught us that? Aubrey Job. And Aubrey Job also taught building construction. And boy, what he knew about building construction. I wouldn't be too concerned if I didn't know what he didn't know. I later worked for Charlie Fulton and Job, and learned a lot.
Well, was history the same as I would have got, which was straight out of Bannister Fletcher?
Exactly. Bannister Fletcher was the book. I bought mine from Stan Marquis Kyle, and I've still got it.
And it finished at the Renaissance.
I'd take your word for that, Robert. I can't really remember.
Well, there was no modern architecture taught, as far as my experience.
No, I think the actual book had a couple of pretty early. Well, my version has anyway. Of course, there were lots of copies. You probably didn't even hear of that book.
Oh, I know. Bannister, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And I never really got any benefit out of it except when I went to Europe.
Yeah. So Aubrey Job was at the college, or was he at UQ?
He was at the college.
Okay,
Yeah.
and when you came out to UQ, who were your teachers at UQ?
Oh, we had Bruce O. Lucas and
Very copy.
yeah, and Cummings.
Yes.
I can't think of anyone else out there. I don't think.
Was Stan Marcus Carl there then, or not?
No,
he
no.
came much later.
He was in the council when I got into that drawing office.
Okay. Yeah.
And there were a lot of English architects that Frank Costello had brought in because he couldn't get the qualified staff here. And they were a pretty interesting bunch in that they were pretty serious about their work too.
So it was 2 final years that you did at UQ, for the 2 final years you did at UQ.
3 final years.
3 final years, sorry.
Yeah.
So from 55 on, taking.
I finished in 56.
54 on.
Those of us that did it in 6 years.
So who finished with you? Peter Gargett?
Yes. Peter, Anne Greenfield and Margaret whatever. And John Dalton, Wolfie Jers, Jim Gibson, who's also a neglected architect and has got a very nice church in Wynnum. He did, John's sort of credited to fellow was president of the Institute and a good publicist for architects.
Tom Cross?
Tom Cross, Cross and Bain. Well, Jim was a sort of hidden partner there, but he was the one that really had the ability. And he did lots and lots of quite sound, sensible buildings.
I've not heard of him.
No, well, that's why I'm raising him now, because I think it's important that he's remembered and noted. Bernie Bryan.
Oh, yeah.
Memory fails me. If I think of any more, I'll tell you.
And
But there were 6 or 7 grades. With one exception, Eric Buchanan, all those who made it to second year made it to 6 years.
What happened to Eric Buchanan? Because he keeps coming up in.
Well, he was a good mind, but he destroyed it with drink.
Okay.
But he didn't have senior.
Okay.
You could start that tech course with junior and some senior subjects. And Eric didn't have those subjects, so he had to stop and do it
Yes.
and then come back into the course a year later.
Right. He was at the council too, wasn't he?
It wasn't with me, I don't remember,
Okay.
but he was a very nice man, and I don't know. He used to live one door from us at home, and
His wife Audrey
yes,
was a ballet
and
teacher.
they were lovely people, and I have no idea what drove him to drink. He'd been a masseur when he started architecture, and Wolf Jers, incidentally, was the treasurer at the Brisbane Tramways. He gave up quite a big job to start architecture. And he never had the vaguest clue about how to design anything. But
He wrote a good spec.
he was the guru on the specification writing, and to this day I get out his notes.
you mentioned one woman, Margaret,
Margaret, I can't remember her surname.
and she was the only woman that studied with you, or were there
Anne
others?
Greenfield.
Anne Greenfield.
Yes, they were the Peter Gargett, Anne Greenfield, and Margaret.
Well, it was Margaret Kerr when she married.
Yes,
but
well,
she
she
would have been
wasn't then.
unmarried then.
Yes,
And
yes,
I can't
she
remember
was.
her first name,
No,
but she's still around and she's in Melbourne.
And she also went into practice, so she finished she graduated as an architect.
Well, she never really practiced. She married a scientist and went off to
Well,
Britain.
Anne Greenfield never practiced either.
Oh, okay.
She married a grazier
Although
down the desert.
she did do work in Britain while she was there.
Did she? Yeah.
Some college at Cambridge, I think, she worked on with somebody eminent, and then came back to Melbourne and didn't practice anymore. But I've talked to her,
Yes.
so she's very willing to contribute to this.
So we should talk to her as well.
Yeah, I last saw her at a reunion. That's decades ago.
And do you remember Carl Langer at UQ?
Oh yes, but I remember him from the architecture course, but more clearly and sharply from the town planning course.
Because you did both?
Yes, he was a great man, Carl Langer. Very great man. I don't think he gets enough credit either. and he was such a nice man. And of course, a lot of the profession disliked him.
Yes, well, that was, I suppose, a hangover from the war, and
Well, he was outspoken about the quality of the work going on, and
yes,
it didn't endear him. And of course, there were people who were established here who were concerned that he was going to take their jobs.
So, of his work, is there anything that you sort of associate with him that you particularly like?
Oh, Jimbo Cottage, now demolished at Surfers Paradise. It was one of the best buildings that I've ever seen.
There's nothing wrong with the main roads building either.
No, it was a sad thing. He designed it, and then he wasn't allowed to do the working drawings.
Well, Cole Tesh finished it, I think.
Yes, Cole did. But the minister thought that Carly was a bit effete and arty, and thought he wouldn't be able to do the construction drawings. And of course, he certainly could, but that's how.
Well, Coltash was a much bigger man.
Yes, he was 6'5", this big, but he was a friend of mine. But he had a great disadvantage in that in the war he'd got an ear infection up in the islands, and he couldn't sleep more than a couple of hours. So he did a lot of work at night. It's probably why he died young.
Well, he also used to teach down at QUT when I was going through.
Yep.
And he was teaching
He
space
was-
writing.
He was also taking applicants for registration when I was doing it, and we thought he was quite wrong in some of his attitudes, which pains me to disagree with Cole, because he was a lovely fellow and a fellow sailor, and but he took the attitude that the architect should take no responsibility for anything. That, for instance, the classic one that came up in the registration exams was if you were called out to look at a building that was had been laid out by the builder, would you check the dimensions and the squareness of everything? And he taught the people to say no, they wouldn't do it. Wouldn't have that responsibility. Whereas everyone else's attitude, certainly including mine, was that that's what you were paid to do.
Well, did he think that you waited till the building got built and then you told them to take it down and do it again?
I never got that far with it. But it certainly was that permeated his thinking, which I didn't agree with. But anyway, that's an offshoot.
So, which practices did you work in during your student years? You worked in the city council a bit, and then...
Well, I worked for the council for, I think, 1 year until there was the municipal elections. And the mayor, Chandler, who'd been the mayor for many, many years, was thrown out, and a man called Roberts. Chandler was leader of this civic municipal organisation.
CMO.
Hmm?
The CMO.
Yeah, which was a predecessor of the Liberal Party. And the other fellow was a Labor fellow. And just previous to that, I'd been to see Frank Costello about getting different experience, because I made a practice of moving every 18 months to get different experience at different offices. And he said, well, that's quite a good idea. I'll keep an eye out for you. And I'll talk to Cook and Kerrison. Anyway, in the meantime, the election was held, and the new mayor and the old town clerk, Slaughter, thought it would be a good idea to get rid of all these people who were obviously anti-Labor which wasn't true. But they had a meeting of the 9 doomed men. There's the city architect, the city engineer, the city health surveyor, all the senior people, even the accountant. And it amounted to 9. And the story, as I get it from Frank Costello, is that Slaughter said it should be rounded off to 10. And quick as a flash, because he said, Peter Heathwood. And of course I was a junior draftsman. And the paper came out in the morning with letters about this high. 10 top council officials sacked, and it went down the list, and on the bottom was Peter Heathwood, junior draftsman. and every Liberal following architect in Brisbane thought, he must be a strong Liberal, he's been sacked for political reasons, and I got rung up offers of jobs everywhere. Anyway, Rob Gibson was at Theo Thorne's, and he rang me and said, you better come over here. So I got introduced to Theo Thorne and John Hitch and got the job. And I was very pleased that I did, because I learned quite a lot from Don Winson and Rob, but particularly Don Winson, who influenced me eventually to do town planning, because he said it was important to do it to gain an understanding of where your buildings were in society, and that's why I started doing planning 10 years later. Oh no, it can't have been 10 years, because I finished a 3-year course in 1966 in planning, so I started in 63. Anyway.
And how long were you at Theo Thorne and John Hitch's office?
18 months. And then I went to what was then known as Job, Collin and Fulton. And I was particularly influenced by Aubrey Job, who would check your drawings, and he knew so much about building construction. He'd write on your drawings in red ink what you've done wrong, and this is how you should do it.
Oh.
And so he was a very good teacher, apart from being a lovely fellow. And eventually I was working for Jim Collin mostly, and Jim was also a very nice man, but I don't know what architecture school he went to, but it wasn't the same thinking as mine. And he asked me to do a carport with columns that sloped down like this, with graded size holes coming down, and I refused to do it. Anyway, he had a bit of an argument, and I wouldn't back down, because I thought it was just absolutely stupid. And anyway, he called me in the next day, and I thought, well, this is the sack. And he said, you're getting on my nerves. And he said, I suppose I'm getting on yours. And he said, I think what you'd better do is go on leave. Take a fortnight's leave. And it just happened that Mum and Dad were holidaying at Southport at the time, so I had a fortnight down there. Came back, and I never worked for Jim again. I always worked for Charlie. And that suited me, because and Jim never seemed to ever hold all that against me at all. We were always on good terms at a personal level.
I heard a story about Jim Collin, about his cupboard details. I think I probably got it from Phil Davidson, but or you, I'm not sure. That the drawer, there'd always have to be a tie drawer, and it'd be the width of a tie, and then there'd be other things to put socks in, and there'd be a special place for that. Everything had to be in its place.
You were
the
sent
wardrobes.
home to measure up
Yeah.
the height of your suits, coats,
That's
and
really sensible.
how the trousers hung and all that sort of thing. So it made you think, what am I doing? The only thing that I thought he wasn't very good at was, well, the only thing where I ever thought he wasn't right was the height of kitchen benches. He always had them too low. But Alf Badley, who was a fellow I grew up with, was building a house for him. And he always told the story, he did quite a few houses for Aubrey, that Aubrey could never make up his mind. And he'd stand where the hand basin was going to be and pretend to wash his hands and then measure that and try. After all those years, he always got it too low. But and he was a big man. But anyway, that's how fussy Aubrey was.
So most of the projects you worked on were residential projects?
Mostly, but also a building which I don't know if it's still standing, but it's next to the other side of the road from coming in George Street, Albert Street, coming towards Queen Street. We did a 3-story building for some jewellers there. I can't remember their names, but I suddenly learnt about inner city drainage from Aubrey and how you always make it accessible for maintenance, and extended the drain up to a point where you could rod it down. I'd done it without any thought about that. Anyway, I've never forgotten that.
So is this when Aubrey had his own practice?
No, it was Job, Coleman Fulton, and before I left, Job and Froud left and started their own practice.
And that would have been to do Torbreck or something else?
I don't know, but we'll come to that. Trying to think. I then went to Crick, Lewis and William, where I must have been in 4th year, I think, and I became the man that did the designs, which I was terribly pleased about and a bit shocked.
So what did you do?
Well, the one that's fresh in my mind is the Kingsford Smith Memorial. And the stadium, as we called it, which became the Festival Hall.
Yes.
Wasn't built precisely to my designs, but in structure it wasn't. The shape of it was. And we did a lot of F. Starthus House in Charlotte Street.
Drive-in theatres?
Oh, yeah, lots of drive-in theatres. That was one of their specialities. They knew nothing about them. Guy Crick forte was movie houses. He'd built or designed half the movie houses in New South Wales in his career. He was a very older man then when he was Crick, Lewis and Williams. But I just can't think of the man's name now, but he was the man who took films from Paramount and
Distributor.
Metro Goldwyn Mayer and whatnot, and redistributed them to picture houses. And he said to Guy Crick one day, "Do you know anything about drive-in theatres?" And Guy said, "I've been following it with great interest, and we haven't done one yet, but I'm all ready for it." Anyway, this fella gave him the commission for Capalaba, the one where the shopping centre is now. And Cricky came from Melbourne Grammar, and he discovered that the architect who was doing the drive-ins in Melbourne was going to he was an old boy also, and they're going to the school, the thing out, to the annual dinner or whatever it was. So he and Bernie Lewis went down, and they organised it to sit next to this chap. This was the first time they did this sort of thing. They did it once again for another matter, and the fellow was inveigled to bring the drawings in for them to look at, because they told him what they were doing, but he wouldn't let them have them. Anyway, he left the drawings up in Guy and Lewis's hotel room. Bernie excused himself in the middle of the dinner, took a few serviettes, whipped up to the room, traced off all the key dimensions and the angles that you could project and so on. And Ian Jenkins and I did the drawings from these serviettes.
Was he right?
It worked all right, yes. Yeah. And Ian tended to do the layouts of the speaker boxes and all that sort of thing, and I did the building and the screen. But they were. Guy Crick was the best job getter that I ever met.
That's what they teach you at Melbourne Grammar.
Well, the Kingsford Smith Memorial he also got after a bit of finagling with the town clerk secretary, and he was delighted to get it. And a couple of days he was much less delighted because he'd been appointed honorary architect.
Oh. I think we didn't ask you, when you were working at Fine and Hitch's office, what were the projects you worked on there?
Service stations.
Mm-hmm.
They did the Ampol service stations. Did dozens of them. And houses. I can't remember doing anything but service stations and houses. But later on it helped, because years later we got a lot of Shell and Neptune service stations. Neptune was just Shell in another disguise. So we got a few bob out of knowing how to do them.
There was some little jobs that I can remember of Theo Thines. There was a dentist surgery just opposite the South Brisbane Library. I think it's called Dock Street.
What was a doctor's surgery?
I thought it was dentist, but it, I thought it was a dentist surgery, but it had a
Before, I
ramp.
I think that would have been later.
Was it?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Andy Stenders did that.
Yeah. It's still there, but it's been done over a few times.
Yeah,
John Voller did it once.
I know the building, or I remember the building.
Has it got a ramp up?
Well, it used to.
Yes,
It
yeah.
used to.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can't remember it, but it's.
That wasn't my time anyway.
Yeah, I think that was Andy's.
Hmm.
But
I
we had
worked
to
at
do
Fines
a
later.
working drawing for college. And Gibson got it, and he made me colour it in the colours that I thought it should finish as a building. And not green for concrete and all that sort of thing.
The code for working drawings.
Not
you
for the
mean?
car. I had the code, and that's what I was about to do, and Gibson said, no. So I did this and caused quite a furore at college. But it looked good.
Yeah, well, you would have had to do those architectural plates that
Oh, gee
of
whiz,
the
yeah.
Ionic column and
Oh, I've still got them.
Yeah.
Roger's kept them. But Eric Buchanan, who came back, he was the master at those things.
Mm.
He did. They were as good as the plates you had to work from. Really first class.
Mm.
He could draw like Billy O. And he hadn't had any background in it. He could just do it.
Well, those skills were still being taught when I started in 1964,
Yeah,
and you had to stretch your Wattmans
it's right.
onto a
Wet it
board,
and
wet it,
tape
and
it round.
tape it, and do your colour washes.
Had to be a very strong board because otherwise the paper would pull the board up.
Oh.
There's a couple. There's,
Oh.
It's marvellous what having a younger brother does for you.
there's two more I can remember.
I didn't think I could ever do anything like that.
I have to take a picture of them later. So.
We laboured over those. Yeah.
Oh, you've used the back as well.
Oh yes. God knows what that means.
Never let a piece of blank paper go straight.
Yeah.
So you were at Job Cullen and Fulton in 4th year, and you stayed there until the end of your study, or?
No, I left them and went to Crick, Lewis and Williams and did the drive-in theatres and things.
Mm-hmm. Ah, yes.
And you stayed there for the 18 months? Or did
No.
you stay there longer because you were getting all the all the good stuff to do?
I was very pleased, but I just served my 18 months there and then went to Job and Proud.
Oh.
So when was that? When you went to Job
Well,
and Frau?
I was there when I graduated, so it was 66. It ended at 66. And from there I went into practice.
No, I've got you down as starting in 1951 to
Yes.
56.
So it's 56.
That's right.
That's when you
Oh, I'm
graduated.
giving you the wrong dates. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
It
correct.
is.
So
56.
56, yes.
56.
So 56
Yeah,
is
66 is all town planning.
Job and Froud.
Yeah.
And what were the projects you worked on there?
Mostly houses.
Mm.
But I was. Bob Froud did all the presentation, and which he was very good, as you know, and we did working drawings. But when I left, I got a job to do the Belvedere Hotel at Woody Point to build fairly extensive additions to it and alter the bar and whatnot. And I brought it into the office. And then I can't remember what triggered it, but I decided to go out on my own. And, I know what triggered it. Dalton and I both entered the Plywood House competition. And we made an agreement that we would go into private practice if we won, because the prize was £3,000. And I reckon he was married, so he had, and a couple, at least one child, I can't remember now. And I won it, and he was runner-up. So we got the money. So I bailed out of Job and Froud, and I didn't ask for that Belvedere Hotel job back, but they gave it to me with their good wishes. And I thought that was very, very nice.
So that got built to your satisfaction or not?
What's that?
The Woody Point.
Yes,
Belvedere.
we supervised it all. Yeah, yeah.
Is it still there?
It's a nice job.
Very much altered.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fairly
The
recently.
hotel's still there, yes.
Very much altered. I went by it last year, and had I not known what it was like, I wouldn't have recognised the thing at all.
Didn't you work on the garden block at Tollbrick?
Oh, with Job and Froud, yes, I did. Yes. Well, that's what I'm sorry. I said I'd come back to Tollbrick, and that was the first really big building that I worked on.
So you said the garden block and not the tower.
No, it didn't do anything on the tower.
Were they built at the same time?
Garden block was built first. And there may have well have been an overlap. I'm not too sure
But
about
the
that.
tower was lift slab, but the garden block
Yes.
was conventional, or?
Even that I don't remember. I remember the tower being lift slab because we were all a bit nervous about it. I was in the office when that happened, but I didn't work on that job.
Yeah. Well, it sounds
But-
pretty
but-
dangerous, doesn't it? That you
Yeah,
poured
Aubrey
a
and
slab
Bob
and jacket.
didn't get paid for the job.
Huh?
Noel Kratzman, who was building it, went broke. And somehow or other he was responsible for the architect's fees and McWilliam's fees too. That's the engineers, structural engineers. And many years after, Aubrey won a judgment against Kratzman and Rowley Pym and Wilfred Betts. Rowley Pym and Betts were the promoters of the thing in the first place. They were both undischarged bankrupts, so how they ever raised money, I don't know. But anyway, eventually they got the money, but 5 or 6 years later. Because I know they were struggling because, you know, obviously they put a lot of money into it and the effort and didn't get anything back. But in those days, the ordinary practice was to finish the sketch, the design, get it approved, then send the bill for it, and then do the working drawings and finish them and get the council approval, and then send the bill. And of course you carry a lot of money. You know, nowadays you say, well, I'd like monthly payments, please, and arrange that. But in those days that was considered a bit unprofessional. And we charged in guineas. Even when I started, we charged in guineas for anything that was time.
Well, that was a good lesson to learn, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, the Belvedere Hotel was pretty interesting because
Included GST.
yes, the owner was a lady who lived in Kingsford Smith Drive, and I can't think of her name. But when they paid the bill for the sketch design in single pound notes. 1,006 pounds. And little Johnny, young Johnny as she talked about, who was in his 60s, came in and paid us and welcomed us to the best of the day, and on off he went. Anyway, we closed the door and opened up the envelope, and here were all these. We did a little dance. We'd never seen so much money in our lives. Anyway, years afterwards, not years after, but a long time afterwards, I found out that our client was a madam who had a prominent place in Albert Street. That's where all the pound notes came from, because I suppose she didn't pay tax on a fair bit of it. But she was a gracious and very nice client. Never had any difficulties, always anything that needed to be discussed was discussed.
Well, I'd like to know how you got the job.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to remember that too.
Contact someone?
Yes, I can't remember how it came to be that because I had no expertise in hotels or anything.
Just brothels.
The only time I'd been in a brothel was Theo sent Rob Gibson and I to measure up a building that had been a brothel opposite the Maxim Cheese Factory in Stanley Street. And we went in and did this measuring, and we just couldn't believe the lurid colours that this place was painted. You know, it was deep purples and just revolting. And there must be something wrong mentally with those people to have come to such awful colours.
Perhaps they were colourblind.
The lights are
Could
out.
be. It might do that to you, of course. Yes, sex is. You'd be surprised at too much of it. But any event, that was the nearest I ever got to a brothel.
And do you remember which architects you admired during your student years?
Yes, I was led to a lot of this through Don Winson, because he was the student in the office, if you like. He was the thinker and the person who got all the architectural records and the American magazines and whatnot, and went through it and showed us what was the importance of these buildings and what it meant and how the architect had come to this conclusion, and you know, a lot of thinking went on that Ian Charlton and I were introduced to.
Have you remained friends with him?
Yes, Ian still sees him, and when I met Ian the other night at the architecture thing, I asked Ian to...
Don's not very well.
No, but Ian still visits him,
Yeah.
and I've asked Ian when he's going next to give me a ring, and I'd like to go out with him.
Well, he lives in the same street as where Robin Gibson used to live in
Well, he
Well,
doesn't-
New
he
Romney.
doesn't
his
live
wife
there now.
Pam does, but
Yeah, that's
Don's
his
been in
house.
a home
Yeah.
for some couple of years now.
Yeah,
But
Yeah. But that was a bit of
but
a
in
corner
that
of the
same
world.
street, Stuart McIntosh lived.
that's right.
Now,
Elm Street West.
did you know him?
Not as Gibbo I grew up with, and I knew Don from working with him, and McIntosh was known to me socially, but not otherwise.
Did you like what he did? Did you know his work?
Sometimes. I didn't think much of his work at the university.
I thought the Great Hall was great.
Well, we never got to see the Great Hall.
But that's
Well,
not
that's
his.
right.
Either his design for it
Yeah.
that didn't get built. Yeah,
Mind you, the one that got built wasn't bad.
yeah, that's right.
But it's strange that he lived right next door to Gibson, who
Yes.
got it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was never highly impressed with Stuart. I think he had a pretty fair estimation of his own abilities and didn't need help from other architects too.
And left town, ultimately.
Yeah. I never knew what happened
Wasn't
to
he
him.
involved in the design of one of the bridges? Was it
Yes, he was.
Victoria?
The
Victoria.
jury reminded me.
Victoria? Well, that's the best bridge we've got.
And also he had a
But it's-
hand in the Riverside Expressway.
Well,
Did
that's
he?
not the best we've got.
Well,
No.
But it's
well,
where it
it's-
is the
it's-
problem.
It's better than
But
it
it
would
might
have
have
been
been.
without him.
Yes, but Victoria Bridge is.
It's excellent.
There's lots of bridges
So take those black
exactly
lights
like
off and
that
it'd be even better.
all over the world.
But he must have gone to other places because there's a bank of his in Canberra for the
Is there?
ES&A bank
Oh, yeah.
that is quite
Yes, and
remarkable.
it'll be a while back. Yeah.
You said that you were looking at architectural magazines, so were you looking at international examples, or were you mainly looking at things that were being built here?
Oh, international and what was the pamphlet come newspaper from Melbourne Uni?
cross section.
Cross section. Oh yeah, all devoured that.
Well, John Dalton used to write it for.
Well,
Queensland, didn't he?
John was a pretty good self-publicist. It's probably one of the ways we got on, because I loved working with him.
Huh? When did that start? When you won this competition
Yes.
for the Plywood House, and that
Yes.
would have been what, about 1960 something?
It was 50s.
No, it was 50s.
56.
56.
It got built in 57, and we started practice in April 57.
And with some work.
Well, we had the Belvedere.
Well, we had the
Hotel.
Belvedere, yeah.
Yeah. And we had the Plywood House. So we thought we had back the work.
Yeah, that's two.
Yeah. And of course, it's still in the family.
Yeah, well, it's that other house at Indooroopilly, which must have
Spears.
come soon after.
That came before.
Before? Oh.
I wasn't qualified when I started doing that. But I sailed at Oxley Sailing Club with Bernie Wallace, W-O-L-L-I-S, none of that matters, and a fellow sailor was George Spear, who had 5 kids, but his house was burnt down. And all the kids, incidentally, were adopted, and a lot of them from the same mother. It was a bit of a curiosity. I didn't know that at the time. But anyway, when his house went down, Bernie and I decided we'd better do something about it. And it was a love job from my point of view, but of course it couldn't have been for Bernie's, but it was a very economical price. And it was a very economical building because it was, we knew we had to get a lot of space for a given perimeter, so it was nearly square. And there were privacy problems, and that hence the screen, they were more privacy than climatic. But of course, as you well know, the reverse happens at night. So I told them they didn't need curtains, but of course they did in the bedrooms. But they were lovely clients and lovely people.
Well, I
And
think
there's 2 buildings I haven't wanted to be knocked down, and that was one of them. And they were both recommended to be knocked down by Ivan MacDonald, so when I talk to Ivan these days, I'm a bit reserved.
What was the other one?
It was a house next door to me in Wynnum. It wasn't an architectural masterpiece, but it was, part of it came out of the 1893 flood. It was washed down the river onto the mud banks at the mouth of the river, rescued and brought into Wynnum. There were 5 houses like that in Wynnum. And I thought it was, well, the town plan said it had to be kept, and I thought it should be. But Richard,
Alan?
Alan and I fought like buggery to get that place protected, but Ivan recommended demolition, and he was being paid by the developer. But anyway, that's another story. But I was very cheesed off with him, because I think he made a wrong decision in both cases.
Yeah, in the case of the Spear House, I don't know the other one, but
Yeah. Well, the other one wasn't a great architectural merit, it was just a historic merit, in that it was...
But the Spear House had been published and acknowledged so widely.
Roger and Steve Trotter and a few others conducted.
Wrote a letter too.
Yeah, well, yeah, Riddel tried to influence the council, but
Bob probably did more.
they weren't paying money. And that's what I think happened.
Well, it still goes on.
Okay. Well, I become more and more cynical about those things as I age.
Well, what about some of those other buildings of the period, like that Carl Langer was doing for Lennon's Hotel? I mean,
Oh yes, we
Did
loved
you-
that. I went there for our first night after we were married.
which one?
the Broadbeach one.
Broadbeach
yeah. There was we used to wander around to look at Carly's buildings, you know, apart from going to Sydney and looking at Harry and all those sort of things. But in Melbourne and John Borland.
Well, did you think Carl was as good as Harry?
Different. Yeah, different.
Probably didn't have as much money to play with.
No, but the buildings he did for himself were pretty austere and money conscious, but they were pretty reasonable.
But that building in George Street, that was the new wing of Lennon's,
Yeah,
opposite
that was
Hicks
that,
Coast
yes.
there.
Yes,
I mean,
it's a
that
good job.
I remember very well when I was a kid,
Yeah.
and I don't remember really very much more about it than that.
Well, I used to eat there a lot after work, between work and college. It was cheap in that bar that went in and out.
Yeah, I used to get my hair cut there, but
It was a great
It
arcade.
was quite cheap.
I can't
I
remember.
don't think it had an arcade. I don't remember it anyway. But yeah, that was a pretty good building. I thought it was a very distinguished and suitable for the reputation that Lennon's had as a superior
I
hotel.
mean, it was right alongside the 30s building that they had.
Yeah, and the entrance was splendid.
And the two of them went together so
Yeah,
nicely
that's right.
in a
Yeah.
sort of very
Yeah.
urban way.
He was urbane. Yeah, he was clever thinking fellow. He influenced me quite a bit. Not that I ever copied the sort of thing he did, but he made me think.
Well, that little building that we use as our studio, do you remember that at all? In Wickham Street, the Valley, which was West's Furniture.
Oh yes, yes I do remember that. We used to, when we got Dalton and I had our houses photographed for publication, we'd go to Laurie and say, can we borrow some of the nice furniture? And we'd take the client's furniture and put it under the house from well away and put all the good furniture in there and have the photographs taken. Gee, we were rude.
At least you knew where to go.
Yeah, that's right. And Laurie was always very cooperative.
Well, Laurie lived
He'd deliver it out there in his own truck.
So which houses, do you remember what they were?
No, I can't say that I
Was
do
it- was
because
there-
we did.
The Brennan house was yours,
That was John's.
was it?
Yes,
And the
and the house next door, Heads, was
yes.
John's,
Okay.
and the flats at Indooroopilly, Heads
Heads
were
flats.
mine.
Right. The Heads had flats at Indooroopilly.
Yes,
Okay.
they were one level, step down the hill.
before
Gordon
the
Head
tiny,
was-
tiny things, but they were good.
Yes, quite a. I don't know whether they're still there. I suppose they are.
And where was your practice initially when you set up? Where did you have
We set up in the MLC building on the corner of
Edward and
Edward and
Adelaide.
Mm.
Which would have been a very smart address.
Yes.
Was
and-
the nicest looking building in town.
No, that was the one that preceded that one. Danny Nutter kicked us out to build the new MLC.
Now, hang on.
There was an old building there, which was cheap because it was going to be knocked down. And we got a room in there.
So, but this was Bates Smart, were the architects from Melbourne for the MLC.
For the building that exists now.
Yeah, which is no longer MLC, but
No, but it was.
But I was looking at it the other day, it's a bloody good building.
it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and worn well.
Mm.
Peter did a shop.
That's Farron Price's shop underneath it, in the ground floor.
Right. And that Farron
But
Price.
that's a shop.
But this isn't where you had your studio, is it?
No, it
Oh,
was
no.
the building that preceded this one.
So near Rose
This was
Arcade,
Farron Price's, yeah.
or near Rose.
Yes,
Yeah.
getting
Cafe.
toward Rose Arcade, but not that far.
So one of the things that happened to Rose in 1958 was that they put in that arcade,
Yes,
which
Yes.
was done by Perry Bland, I think.
I don't know who did it.
And
It wasn't very distinguished anyway.
wasn't it? Oh, okay. I've never
Well,
seen
I
it.
didn't think so. Yeah, no.
But
Tom Perry is that.
That's
I
his.
couldn't think of
Tom.
Tom.
Oh, yes.
Tom.
But there were a succession of arcades that happened about that time. The
Yes, there
Piccadilly
were.
Arcade.
That
Bludgers.
Bludgers did. That was more successful visually, I thought, but it wasn't as successful commercially.
Well, it had some good tenants.
Yes. Well, I was my brother-in-law
Merlot. Not Merlot.
and I went there for some reason or other, after work and had a cup of coffee, and there was a very attractive lady came and talked to us, and we were, you know, eyes wide open looking at this gorgeous creature. And I've forgotten what was said, but there was something said about attractive women or something. And she told us that she was a male.
And this is Brisbane.
Well, we'd never struck such a person before.
So your eyes were wider open.
we learned a bit that day.
So,
Mako's
the
exhibition.
before getting further into your work,
1965.
you mentioned that this book, The Bannister Fletcher, was useful when you went to Europe. Did you work abroad, or did you?
No, I didn't work in Europe. I didn't go to Europe until relatively late in life.
Oh, okay.
I'm not even sure that I was working. I might have retired.
Okay, so because many of the people we spoke to said that immediately after they finished their studies, they went to Europe and they did the grand
we
tour.
did. We'd booked a ship to go, and then we found that 9 months and 2 weeks afterwards we were going to have our first child after we were married. So we cancelled the ship, and they were good enough to give us our money back, and we bought a bit of land.
And then a house.
And then we built a house on it when we saved up a bit of money. Yeah, and got a loan from the Mount Cravat Terminating Building Society number 14 or something like that.
A good house?
I thought it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent house.
Still there?
No.
No, been knocked down.
Pictures?
Not,
Yeah, well,
Floorings?
it was knocked down. I was Minister for Local Government's Town Planning Advisory Committee chairman, and we used to meet in the Main Roads building. And John, I'll think of his name in a minute, was the Deputy Commissioner, and he was on our committee. And I got there a bit early one day, and John said, "Oh, just the man I want to see. Come with me." And he took me into a great design office, and here was a map showing New Farm Park and our house by the river, and there was a single line coming across from New Farm, across my house and going on. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "That's the centre line of the new bridge." And I said, "Oh God, what the hell? I'll have to sell it before this word gets out." And he said, "Sorry, old chap, you can only sell to us." and so we couldn't stand the idea of living there in a condemned house. And anyway, then I realised I had to get a valuer. And Ernie Smith, who just retired as Valuer General, was also on our committee. So I turned to Ernie and said, "Well, now that you're retired, do you think you could mount a case for me to get the maximum valuation for my house?" He said, "Oh, I'll be glad to." So he negotiated with his successor, and I got a reasonable figure. And was able to come down here. There's another long story which I won't bore you with, but buy a huge builder's box down here, you know, all brick and concrete. It had holes in the wing walls. Jim Collins would have approved.
But what's the sequence of the new farmhouse and the house that you built?
It wasn't New Farm, it was this side, it was Galloway's Hill.
Oh, Galloway's Hill.
And that's the one that was our first house. That was
That was it. Okay.
That was knocked down. Yeah.
So, what was the address of that house?
It was in Wendell Street. Wendell Street does a right angle turn. It was on the internal corner. But it's gone now. I might have some pictures. He's a very keen photographer and records things that I don't. But it was a very pleasant and very economical building. It had to be economical, of course.
So when did you marry?
57, April 57, just after we started the practice.
Huh.
And John Dalton was left to do the working drawings of the beloved house while I went in my honeymoon.
But you said that, did he also put in an entry?
Yes,
So there were two entries, one,
mine and his.
but he drew yours.
Well, that was the
He
winning
did the
entry.
Oh, the
working
win-
drawings
oh, I
They
see.
for
were the
it.
winning entry, and they were commissioned to
Yeah.
build it.
I
Galloway's Hill House,
I
is it?
got the first prize. Oh, there it is, yes.
It's not the original or the best colour scheme.
No, it was,
Oh.
and it really
This-
wasn't
this
that blue.
overlooked
It
the
was
river and had
different blue.
shutters that pull down, or the awnings, windows that opened
Okay.
up without glazing.
And the bit on your
Sounds nice.
right was an
An
extension
extension.
for when we found ourselves with 3 more kids.
So when did that extension happen?
I can't remember, Bob, but we were.
No, it's
10 years later?
Oh, probably not that long because we were 4 children in 4.5 years.
Mm.
Then we found out
What caused it?
So how long did you stay together with John Dalton?
um,
One of the gates.
we had my famous 18 months as partners.
2 boys and 2 girls.
Then we had 18 months in association, and then I'll tell you the story because even though he's dead, I hesitate a bit to say it, but his wife came in, Sheila, with a black eye and a bashed up nose and whatnot, and said, "Where's John?" And he'd left earlier and said, "If Sheila comes in, tell her I've gone to Timbuktu." And it turns out he'd gone to put lookout with the air hostess that he was consorting with at the time. And he'd bashed her, his wife, and I just couldn't handle that. So when he came back, I said, "That's finished. Either you move out or I do." He wouldn't go, so I went. But I loved working with him because we'd fight and argue and finally get to, I think, what's the right solution. But his morals were beyond my capacity to put up with. But then again, he was a much older man than us, you know. But not that I ever got old enough to get to his house, but he'd been in the British Army of Occupation in Germany. And I noticed in his own story of his life, he was in the RAF, but he never was. He was a conscript in the British Army. He wasn't in the actual war, he was afterwards. That was just his age.
When you left that practice, what did you set up on your own, or did you go and
Straight away. Yeah, I just took my work and
went?
got a rooms further down Queen Street.
And did that include when you left? I mean, had this, for instance, been finished, or was that still?
Oh, the Belvedere was well and truly finished, yes.
Okay.
which project did you? Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to ask the Farron Price.
What's that?
When was that one done?
Farron Price. That was done very early. It probably starting at the end of 57. We were terribly proud of all that. When I look at it now, I'm not so impressed, but the story about it is a fellow called Jeff Rainsford was Farron Price's Queensland manager, and he came to us. Although I say it myself, we was a bit flavour of the month at that time, and we got lots of work on reputation. And he wanted in that building, the new shop designed, and he didn't say money was no object, but he did say, we want a good design. Almost suggested not without restraint of money, but it had to be good. And we thought we did it. And then we sent the bill to Mr. Farron Price in Adelaide, and he wouldn't pay. And we kept sending the bill again, and he wouldn't pay. Anyway, we started to make threatening noises, pretending we had a solicitor behind us. And anyway, he turned up in the office, and he started to question us about what had happened and what went on and what not. It turns out that Rainsford had got his girlfriend, who was an assistant in the shop, pregnant, and that he'd been stealing money from J. Farron Price.
Oh.
And Farron Price thought that we must be part of the conspiracy, because we knew nothing about it when he was questioning us, so we obviously didn't say anything wrong, and he did pay. But Farron Price but Rainsford went to jail,
Yes.
and so did the girlfriend.
Is this her?
Oh, yeah, it's the girlfriend looking at you, like over on the other side of the counter.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you are.
Yeah.
So this
Well,
looks
it looks
like
as if she might have been worth it.
looks like one of Laurie's chairs, though. He eventually did all right out of
yeah,
you.
we got well, we had this idea of a cave of jewellery and whatever, but from a merchandising point of view, it wasn't a very clever thing to do, which I've since learnt. It could have been dark, but it needed to be a lot more light. But the thing that was widely imitated, in the front shop there was a sort of cup-shaped bench where you could lay out watches and jewellery and whatnot without going in the shop. And that feature turned up in jewellery shops all around Brisbane for years afterwards.
Oh, this thing. No?
Well, it was like that. I can't remember visualise whether I think that's internal, but you can probably see it
Yes.
across.
Yes.
anyway.
And what were the early projects you were working on when you started on your own?
What was I working on? It came to my mind a minute ago, and now I can't remember.
It'll come back when we.
I know it had quite a bit of work for a practice that had been going, a matter of months.
Roger probably have a picture of it there. What is it?
Roger, when did you start?
Yeah, that one was all over Farron Price.
61 at the QUT.
I can't remember what I took with me.
Well, that would have been 1960 then, that you started on your
It
own.
would have been about that, yes.
1960, yeah.
So what do you remember as the first project?
Roger was.
Oh, well,
he was a
I joined
student.
the practice till 72.
But you would have been aware of what
Oh,
was
I used to
going on.
visit the office from time to time. But,
Yeah, well,
in the
Roger's-
MLS, in the building a few doors down from the post office,
Queen Street.
from Queen Street.
Mm.
On Main Street.
And what it was an insurance company.
Or maybe we should.
Civil. No, that was
Yeah.
Dalton Heathwood. Yeah.
We should turn the question around to trigger your memory and ask, what do you consider your most important works of your architectural career?
Oh,
Oh.
the one you'd like to be remembered for.
Yes.
Well, one of them would be the medical services building at Rockhampton Hospital. that hospital is designed so that every patient, including in intensive care, can see the sky and outside. And I can vouch for it being good because I was in it earlier this year as a patient. Yeah, that's it. And it's an awkward. It was only one place to put the thing, and it was skewed to north, so there was no. And it was the cheapest hospital that's been built in donkey's years. Skin flint finishes and whatnot, but those hoods are all filthy now. When it was first built, the manager used to hose them down, and there are taps outside for doing it. But obviously it hasn't been cleaned for years.
Well, it's many, many years old now.
Yeah, it's all cobwebs and
So, what year is this?
oh, gosh.
Late 70s.
There's
Might be
a,
early 80s.
Yeah.
I can check it.
The office did a lot of hospitals work before and after that, but a lot before I had very little to do with. But after I had all to do with.
So
there was a building that had hoods like that in the city that I remember, down in Mary Street or something. Just
In
near the-
Sydney?
No, in Brisbane.
Elkins. Oh, that
Jeffrey
was
Pies.
that was
Jeffrey
in,
Pies, yeah.
that's Danny Nutter and Ange Alton and John Curran.
No.
Had concrete hoods
No.
Can't remember, I
The
just-
Canegroves
Oh,
building
yes,
they
yes.
didn't they do the Canegroves?
next to the cane groves.
This was
So this
No,
one is
it's
the big
down
one
near
that's
the heritage.
right down the other end.
Meldham House, opposite Meldham House
Yeah.
Opposite Northern House.
Yeah.
in the city.
Yes. Yeah, Jeffrey Pye, I think, didn't it?
I think so.
I have to admit I can't bring it to mind.
Was it AGL? It was something like
There's
that.
a car park in the basement.
But that look became quite, well, I wouldn't say it was used very much, but it,
You can't. Yes, well, there's things in it that you wouldn't do now with a bit more money, but it was a bit too successful because we ended up with $60,000 under budget, and the top floor was to be completed as a perimeter wall and nothing in it, and we were able to build a maternity ward there, and
so they were very pleased with you.
well, two of my grandsons are actually born there, but that's by the by. But the job went almost exactly 1 year over time, built by Citra, a French firm, who were the greatest lot of scoundrels and liars and cheats that I've ever had anything to do with, ever. They would tell you to your face just dead lies. And the project managers were people called Optimum Project Control. In fact, one of our previous employees was one of the partners.
83. Well, it was went to tender in 83.
Was it? Yes, it was 83.
Anyone for more coffee or tea?
What a good idea.
Yeah, you must be getting a bit dry. Or
But
would you like
anyway,
something wetter?
we worked for 12 months without any money
Bob?
because
Water, thanks.
Water?
we couldn't get, we had no right to ask for extra money. And we employed an architect full time. The government employed a clerk of works full time, and it still couldn't catch up with the stinkers. And when it was finished, it had to be occupied. They just couldn't be without it anymore. And there was 89,000. It might have been 98,000. I can't remember which way. that I refused to certify because there was that much work to be corrected on it.
Right.
There were actually walls that were like that, to exaggerate, but they just weren't even plumbed.
So you had to get another contractor in to fix it?
No, it never happened. We never paid the money or certified the money, and the government never fixed anything.
Hmm.
And when I was in it a couple of months ago, you could see a lot of the result of it, but most people wouldn't notice. You know, all of us would probably, with an architect's eye, notice, but and all the shelves that had fallen down from being supported on plasterboard, you know, they'd have to be fixed up. But there were lots and lots of things like that. And anyway, years went by, and suddenly the government made an ex gratia payment of that amount to Citra. He'd gone back to Paris, they'd pulled out of Australia altogether. And we were stunned, couldn't figure it out. And in the Fitzgerald inquiry, the minister was questioned. And it turned out that Citra had been bribing the minister. And the minister had, as a result of a bribe, paid them.
Oh dear.
And he went to jail for 8 years. I don't know that that wasn't his only sin. I'm trying to think of his name.
Yeah, I
Austin
can't
or
either.
Rod
Wayne?
Young, was it? Rod?
Yeah.
Anyway, it was a horror project. But in the event, we, some months after the job was finished and occupied, I thought, well, it's worth asking the board if they would give us some help with that year's expenses. So I totaled them all up and sent and asked them, and they paid up. So it was a big
You
relief.
didn't even have to bribe the minister.
We didn't have to bribe the minister or the board. But in those days they were hospital boards, as they are apparently now. But it was an awful time.
So is this building we're in anything to do with you?
No.
I don't know who designed city architecture. Somewhere
Yes,
1977.
I can't think of his name. But a fairly competent fellow they had in Jim Birrell's, had been Jim Birrell's job. Birrell, incidentally, sent us Perry House conversion from warehouse to offices, and he was approached to do it, but he was the university architect and couldn't, and he recommended us to the client. And anyway, that was a very interesting job. And he also, as the university architect, got us to do the insectary at Moggle Farm, which was also an interesting building in that fully grown steers had to be got into this little building. The walls were sheet steel and so on, so with the doors opening off the corridors. And the printery at U of Q at St Lucia.
One for Bob.
Thank you.
I've already drunk it.
Come for
It
you.
was your glass.
I'm wondering, but you go ahead.
Oh, well, I'll get you a cup. I'll get you a glass as
You're
well.
the one who's talking.
Yeah, well, that's right, too much probably. Anyway, you asked me what buildings am I particularly proud of.
Yes.
Well, Spears, of course.
Is John Spear her builder? Would he have grown up
No.
in that house? No,
No,
different family.
no. There is a John Spear, but he was the brother of the owner. No.
What was the year of Spears?
What's that?
The year that was built?
Must have been 56.
It was started before I went into practice like design,
Oh,
but
yes.
so it would have been 57.
Yeah.
Yeah. And before that, again, I did a house for John Rudder, Chelmer and a house for Jeff Maiden at Mount Gravatt, which both of whom grew up with me and were bosom pals. And until Jeff died, he was, and John, I'm afraid to say, is nearly there. So I talk to him. I try to talk to him every day, but sometimes he can't talk. But he hasn't got long to go. And I designed a second house for John where he now lives at Corona Downs, which I was out there the other day to see him, and I became quite proud of that building. Rutter House, Corona Downs. It was just a very pleasant building to be in, which the site, of course, helps it a lot.
What's the actual address of it?
It's Qualee Crescent, Quahle. Grove, not Crescent. Corona Downs, and I couldn't tell you the number, but you'd get there at the front. Rutter, R-U-T-T-R. They certainly wouldn't want to be disturbed for quite some time, I'd say. He wouldn't be surprised if he's gone this afternoon, you know, sort of thing. I'm proud of a lot of buildings I've done, I can't think of them.
There's one
Roger.
there's one at
Maybe I should make a list for you and forward it.
Yes.
There's the one.
Fulcher's isn't bad. It's
What's it- what's
still
that?
in good nick. Fulcher's.
No, yes, that's an interesting one. Our niece, who is also an architect, rang up one day and said, I've just been to a house that's for sale and I think it might be one of yours. So Roger
Well,
and
that's
I
not
went
quite
out
true.
there, and
She
we were
said-
given the address and I
So
knew
I've
that
been
it
asked
was.
I've been asked to find out who the architect is, and I've no idea. But we thought you might know. And she should have known, because the cupboard details in her house she grew up in and the Fulcher house are almost identical.
Anyway, we went out and looked at it and it was just the way it was built.
Okay.
Nobody had done anything to it. And
What
Oh,
the-
wow.
What
it had a
this was earlier this year, and the house was, when was it built? We've got the drawings. Frank
Oh.
Holmes did the work.
I
on
don't know,
drawings.
long time ago. But
Where is it?
Alexandra Street, Barden, and I'll have to look up the number for you.
After visiting it, and going to the auction, Peter bought the dining room.
Yeah, there was a Danish quality furniture suite, a dining suite in it,
This way.
Okay. Oh yes.
and it was like new. And I said to one of the descendants, if nobody in the family wants that dining suite, I'd be interested. And they rang up later and said, well, would you like to make an offer? And I did, and it's in my place now. The only difficulty was that I'd just bought some
Thank you.
some Y chairs. What's the designer?
Butterfly.
Hans Wegner knockoffs.
Not Finial. Probably the best. Pardon?
Wegner?
Wagner.
Wagner.
Yes. I just bought some for our big table, which I designed, which was 6 feet long. And we've still got the chairs and the tables become the bed head, because I couldn't think of it. I didn't want to sell it. I didn't want to sell it. But
Yes.
we've got all these chairs. We don't know what to do with them.
These open in the bedrooms to let low level
And
air in at night,
Of
and then you can draw
that
these
period,
out,
if you
slide the
think of
windows
other
and draw the
buildings of
shades
your own,
across.
please mention them. But of that period,
let air
which other
get
buildings do you
secure.
think were interesting in Queensland by other architects or other firms?
Other architects.
I mean, what about John Dalton's work? Did you have a favourite of his?
Yeah, but I can't think of the name.
We've now looked at the owner's case.
I mean, what about the house he did for Zelman Cowan at the university?
Yeah, I thought that was very good indeed.
Mm.
So did Solomon Cowan.
Mm.
I've never actually seen it. I've never been. I've driven past, but never been in it.
But it's gone now.
Has it?
The university demolished it.
Oh, God. Ivan McDonald must have been there again. Poor old Ivan. I should shut up about him. But
How much we run out of battery? Didn't take long.
now I should have.
Peter, you did a lovely building at QUT. There's one on your.
Oh yes, I'm proud of the law building.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah, that's a goodie.
Business studies.
Yeah, well, business studies has been buggered up altogether. They stripped the hoods off it,
Mm.
and no doubt their air conditioning doesn't work anymore. But anyway, can't, because it was designed being protected from the sun, and now it's not.
Mm.
Probably everyone's complaining. Well, I'd be amazed if they weren't. But law building is not as efficient as it might be internally, because the law people couldn't tell us what they needed. And we just ended up doing big floors and leaving them blank because they couldn't make up their minds. So they were pretty hopeless clients in the sense of being organised.
Mm.
They didn't know what they wanted, and they didn't know who was going to do anything, and there was a little faction fights among them. And in the end, Ross Meakin, who had worked here, he was the university's architect, just said, look, just provide them with big open space and we'll battle it out after. So I was a bit disappointed that the interiors now are pretty ruddy ordinary.
Mm.
But the sound control works. And that's another building we've withheld large sums of money on from the builder, who subsequently went broke. People from Sydney. Been going for since the 30s.
What's that?
The builder of Law Building.
The law building? Oh, that was Civil and Civic.
No. No, it wouldn't be Civil and Civic if I had any way with it. They're crooks.
Oh, concrete construction.
Concrete constructions, yes.
Yeah. Well, they built the firm called Concrete Constructions built the new farm Holy Spirit Church.
Did they really?
1930.
Yeah. So they'd been going all that time, and not long after. I had no complaint with them on that law building. It wasn't them I was referring to, where it was Civil and Civic who.
What?
They've got a. Well, they shouldn't say it in front of others, but they've certainly got.
Shouldn't say it in front of a camera.
The camera is off, but the audio is still on.
Well, yeah, they've got a lot to answer for various financial matters.
So it sounds like sun protection, sun hoods, climate design was actually
We only do it half-heartedly.
really
Yeah, well, and law building was designed to have
yes.
flexible blades on the western side, and of course we couldn't afford it, so they were fixed so that only got a bit this way.
Yes.
Except in the middle, where that we do have flexible little blades. But the Oh, you're constrained with money with a lot of those jobs.
John Hitch did a building in Rockhampton that you might know for the works department there.
Did he?
And they left the blades off altogether.
Oh, well, yeah.
And luckily we got a job many years later, found the drawings and said, this is what it needs. And they put them on and it's perfect.
Oh, that's good.
Doug Wilson did a huge engine testing factory, train engine testing factory up there, little workshop, I suppose you'd call it. Really big. It had to be soundproof, and I can imagine running up diesel engines as fast as they can go and all that sort of
Good inside. It's good inside. It's not very fantastic. Police Academy?
Yes. Yeah, I did all the buildings there except the administration, which Michael Cadillo did.
So what's this job?
Police,
Police Academy at Oxley.
Oh.
Soon to be abandoned.
Yes. It was.
But abandoned for what? Because the other one's not happening.
Well,
I think
well,
that's the
maybe
only
it
reason
isn't
it's
going to
still
be
there. I
there.
think this one's still there.
Yeah.
I mean, we were working on the other one.
Oh,
it
wow.
stopped.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well, that's crook. You haven't got a job.
that's right.
Yeah.
So,
God, mind you, we should have got it.
Nobody asked us.
Are there any other buildings? You mentioned Dalton Constructions. Which other architects do you think were doing good projects in that period? Or which other projects do you think were good?
Eagles?
Who?
Glen Eagles?
which was Maury Hurst. Oh no, sorry, Glen Eagles was Curro Nara Charlton.
Yeah, well,
But you mentioned the Broadbeach Hotel. Did you also know the Chevron that was David Bell? I mean,
yep.
Do you think that was
in our time.
that was
Yeah, I thought
good stuff?
that was the best he ever did.
What happened to him? Did he go from Brisbane?
No, he retired and devoted a little bit of his time to the furniture factory, and then I don't know where he went from there. Probably died.
And what did you make of the projects by Hayes and Scott? Because many people mention them as
Right. Yeah, they influenced me quite a lot. We used to go around St Lucia and look at all their buildings too, and photograph them, and discuss them, but
When you say you,
beautifully simple.
who was this sneaking around the suburbs of St Lucia with you?
Well, Gibson and me,
Yes,
because we lived close together,
yes.
and from time to time there'd be other people like Eric Buchanan and whatnot.
and they were teaching at UQ when
Carina Bakery, I'm very keen on that. But it's you could now, it's been all altered.
I think you had a photograph of the Carina Bakery, better one than we have.
we do.
When those slides that you put up the other
I think we
night.
should
Yes.
bring the slides to you and have you tell us.
It was a photograph that I'd taken, but we don't seem to have it anymore. The master plan for NBCAE at Castledine. That was a big job for us. And that was another instance where Rod Fuller came into my life in a very favourable way. He was the judge of the plywood house competition.
You wrote that on my essay, actually, when I sent it to you.
He-
Yes.
2 or 3 times in my life he
Yeah.
did things that ended up very favourably for Peter Heathwood.
And your office, did any significant architects pass through your office after you set up, or would you consider it?
Yes.
Ken
Michael
Down, I
Cardillo and
suppose.
Fergus Wilson.
Hmm? Who?
Michael Cardillo and Fergus Wilson.
Yeah, well, they were both very clever people.
But did many people pass before that, or was always relatively small?
Well-
I think we were 24 at the biggest.
Yes, at one time. Yeah.
With a 5-minute walk between offices.
And
Ken
after,
Down, yeah, who was there?
well, Roger did a lot of
Ivan McDonald.
good work in Malaysia and Belize. We had offices in both places. But when he came back, we had some architects from, or student architects from Malaysia came and worked for us. But as far as I know, none of them have done any memorable work.
Rolfie's doing good stuff.
Who?
Rolfie.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's, well,
I got an email
and
from
Wim,
him the other day.
Wim would be,
Wim Van Zyl.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know what he's up to these days. Last time
Oops, sorry.
that was the NACO stand at the exhibition.
Well, I fear we're going to run out of tape soon, but I think we should come back if you manage to construct your list and talk to
I
you
better
once
give
more.
it a bit of thought as to what you're driving at.
what about Marjorie's house?
Yes, that's another one that's gone. Yeah, there it is there. That's on the Esplanade at Manly, or it was.
And when was that
Overlooking
done?
the boat harbour.
Yeah, my mother-in-law's house.
What year would that
It
be?
was on a geological fault,
Oi.
so we limited it to 8 columns and put adjustable foundations, footings. So as it moved, we could adjust it to get it level again. And we in its life, we moved it quite a few times.
Is this the,
Sturgis.
that's the Sturgis I was going to say.
Oh,
Is that
that's
another
Des
important-
Sturgis's. Yes. Had a very strange experience with that job. At the end of the 6 months defects liability period, I went out to have a look at it, and his wife, can't think of her name now, but a delightful lady. Des came home unexpectedly, and she said to me, "Oh, Peter, I've got something to thank you for." And I said, "Oh, yes." She said, "I'm pregnant." This is in front of Des Sturgis, the senior barrister in Queensland. Thelma, her name. And, I was just stunned on what the hell to make of all this.
Yes.
And then she said, "Oh, I'm in the homemaking instinct." And I breathed a sigh of relief.
Oh dear.
I think
They buggered that up. They went and put sort of fake plastic Corinthian columns on it.
No, that's not true. They were aluminium.
Or aluminium, sorry.
Was it the Sturgises who did that?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think we need to start wrapping up, but we could come out and talk to you again and go into
All
a bit
right.
more detail
Let's
for
do
the
that.
project. But maybe
Maybe I should sit down and
Yes.
think about it.
that would be wonderful.
Yes.
And we can also bring out the photos that we obtained and maybe you recognize.
And
in
I've
your
really
projects.
forgotten some of the jobs that I did.
There are a lot of lovely photographs
Yes.
of images of
Yeah.
projects here.
Oh, excuse me,
So
getting up.
Roger has been
Yes.
Well, Roger's been,
That's
that job was very significant, I think, because it was one of the best laid out colleges in
oh yes.
in
That's the
this
master plan.
town.
That's the one building we did on campus.
Right.
And this walkway. but it's gone. It's been demolished too.
Okay.
Surprising if
Very
you
cool
if you live long enough, how many get knocked down.
Yeah.
Mm.
You had that problem, no doubt.
I'm claiming a record because I did when I worked for Theo.
Mm.
We did up the fishboard at the end of the Victoria Bridge, and before I graduated, it was knocked down.
Maybe to finish, which buildings that were constructed later on or have been constructed recently do you think are important for Queensland, if any? Hopefully.
Yes. Well, of recent years, I just haven't wanted to do any big buildings because I didn't want to be tied down. I'd rather go sailing. But
Or by
and
other.
I have taken 4 to 5 months off every year to go sailing. So, except 1 year when I couldn't get away. But so I just don't want to be tied down. And I've done little tiny jobs.
But I think the question was what jobs are out there that you like that
Of
other people
anybody's.
have done.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
Sorry.
Righto. Recent buildings.
I mean, there's a new Supreme Court just opened.
Yes. And Jim Birrell's an architect who I have a great deal of respect for and time for. I think he's done some great buildings. He's done some unbelievably coarse buildings too. In Marucci Hall, when he did those 5 multi-storey buildings that had to be started before a certain date, and he handed them out to all sorts of other people, and they're just boxes with holes in. Frightful. But he's got more brains than most of us. He's very, very intelligent. He's also a drunk. I had a strange experience. I was chairman of the awards night years ago at the cultural centre, and Jim had been chairman of the Civic Design Awards Committee. So he was to give an address about why they awarded the particular buildings.
So that one.
And he didn't turn up.
Oh, really?
He worked with us,
And I went over to Eddie Codd and I said, Jim hasn't turned up. Would you mind just giving your mind to these awards for civic design so you can say something if we have to? And he said, right, I'll go and think of that. And Jim didn't turn up, and he didn't turn up. And just before he was about to be introduced, he turned up. And he's got a silly look on his dial, and he's got a little dolly bird hanging onto a hand. And he came in, he's obviously drunk. And I thought, what'll I do? Anyway, whatever. And he always introduced new ideas into the discussion. And I always enjoyed his conversation, although you have to be careful to avoid getting tied up in the booze with him, because he, you couldn't handle, you couldn't stay with him.
There were a lot of architects in your generation were big drinkers, weren't they?
What's that?
A lot of architects in your generation were big drinkers.
Oh, I'm sure that's not right.
No, I'm teasing because
Well,
Well, the fellas in my year certainly weren't.
no.
They were played up now and again, but not consistent drinkers. Owen Ryan was one who liked to drop
No,
perhaps more than anybody else. With.
Primary school, preschool, primary school.
He died young with cancer. He was the fellow that shifted. His practice was at Coolangatta. And he shifted a 2-storey brick building from one end of the street to the other.
How?
I wouldn't have thought it was possible without cracking it, but they did quite well. No trouble at all.
Mm.
I think we should finish because
Well, yes.
we're not going to be able to
Yeah.
tape everything.
You mightn't. Yes,
But
well,
would it be okay if we talk to you again and
please,
once you've had some
please,
time to think about it?
I've enjoyed myself, but I'm sorry to have been so inadequate.
No, not at
These
all.
things.
We have a lot of information. It's only that we were inadequate with our technical.
Not long enough.
Yes, not long enough. We should invest in that long. So thank you for the interview. I'm going to shut
Oh,
this
well,
down.
it's my pleasure. And,
I think a lot of the